The weight of December. The hum of the mall vibrated through the thin walls of the employee lounge. Laughter, the jingle of cash registers, the artificial cheer of Christmas music, it all blurred into a single, mind-numbing drone. Nick Henderson sat on the stiff wooden bench, rubbing his temples as the fluorescent lights above flickered erratically. The stale scent of reheated pizza from the food court mixed with the cheap pine-scented spray they used to enhance the holiday spirit. But the magic of Christmas had lost its grip on Nick years ago. The small, battered locker in front of him held nothing but the frayed remnants of a costume that once filled him with purpose. The Santa suit hung limply on a metal hook, its once bright red fabric dulled with age. The faux fur lining on the cuffs was beginning to thin, and the belt buckle had a small crack on the edge, an unnoticed detail to others but a glaring one to Nick. He exhaled heavily, running a hand through his graying hair before gripping the edges of the locker for support. The cold metal bit into his fingers, grounding him. He needed a moment. Just one more moment before putting on the mask, before becoming the man these kids believed he was. Another year, another Christmas, he muttered under his breath. And another damn Santa suit. He wasn't sure when the magic had faded. Maybe it was the exhaustion of working this gig every holiday season for over a decade. Maybe it was watching families pass by, parents holding their children close, while he had no one to hold. Maybe it was the weight of all the Christmases he had lost, the ones spent alone, with nothing but the echoes of memories that never faded, memories of a time when love and laughter belonged to him, before it was ripped away. Nick closed his eyes and let his mind wander back, just for a second, to a Christmas that didn't feel so empty. The warmth of a home decorated with mismatched ornaments, a woman's laughter ringing through the air. The scent of cinnamon and cloves from freshly baked cookies, a record player softly spinning an old Nat King Cole song in the background. The twinkling lights reflected in her dark, beautiful eyes as she whispered, "You make the holidays worth it, Nick. Just you." And then, as quickly as it came, the memory dissolved like a snowflake melting in the palm of his hand. He clenched his jaw. It was better not to remember. The door to the lounge creaked open, snapping him back to the present. A fellow employee, some kid barely in his 20s, peeked in. "Hey, Santa. You good? You're up in 5. Nick forced a smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, kid. Just gearing up." The door clicked shut again. He turned back to the mirror. The reflection staring back at him was a stranger. Deep lines creased his forehead, evidence of years weighed down by regret. The sparkle in his blue eyes, the one that used to match the twinkle of Christmas lights, had faded long ago. For a brief moment, he considered walking out. Just slipping through the back door and disappearing into the cold December air. No one would notice. No one would care. But then he thought of the kids. Little ones who still believed. Who still saw magic in the world, in the chubby old man in the red suit, in the promise of Christmas morning. And even if Nick himself had lost that belief, maybe, just maybe, he could give them a little bit of it. With a resigned sigh, he reached for the Santa suit and pulled it on, the familiar weight settling over his shoulders. The thick, padded fabric no longer felt like a costume, it felt like armor. A shield against the emptiness. The moment he placed the Santa hat on his head and tugged at his fluffy white beard, he straightened his posture. This was the role he knew how to play. With one last glance in the mirror, he muttered, "Showtime. Greenfield Mall, Christmas Wonderland." The holiday section of Greenfield Mall was decked out in all its artificial splendor. A towering Christmas tree stood at the center, decorated with oversized baubles and twinkling lights. Fake snow drifted lazily from hidden machines above, settling on the heads of giggling children. The scent of peppermint and gingerbread wafted through the air, mixing with the underlying smell of bustling shoppers, plastic packaging, and food court grease. A line of restless children stretched down the decorated pathway, each one clutching wish lists scribbled in crayon, their parents holding their hands with amused, and sometimes exasperated, expressions. Nick took his seat on the plush red throne, forcing his lips into a well-practiced smile. And so it began. Child after child clambered onto his lap, their eyes wide with belief as they rattled off their Christmas wishes. Some wanted dolls. Some wanted toy cars. Some, with hopeful eyes, asked for things that Santa couldn't give, things that broke his heart. Can you bring my daddy home from heaven? Can you make mommy and daddy love each other again? Can you make my little brother not sick anymore? Each time, Nick's smile faltered just slightly before he recovered, offering words of warmth and comfort, promising he would do his best, even though he knew he had no real power over those wishes. But then, as the line thinned and the evening wore on, a little girl stepped forward. She was small, wrapped in a pink puffy coat, her mittens hanging from strings at her wrists. Her dark brown eyes held something different from the other children, not excitement, but something deeper, something almost knowing. She clutched a piece of paper in her tiny hands, approaching Nick with slow, deliberate steps. Nick smiled. Well, hello there, little lady. And what's your name? The girl hesitated before answering, her voice soft but steady. Ava. Beautiful name, Nick said warmly. And what would you like for Christmas, Ava? Ava didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a worn, slightly crumpled photograph. She smoothed it out carefully before holding it up for him to see. Nick took it, still smiling, until he saw the face staring back at him. The air left his lungs. His body went rigid. The laughter around him dimmed. The Christmas music faded into white noise. The twinkling lights overhead blurred into a haze. Because in his hands, in this fragile, time-worn photograph, was the face of the woman he had spent his whole life searching for. And she was holding a baby. Ava's voice was soft, almost hesitant. Santa? Do you know my mommy? Nick's hands shook. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. Because he did. He knew her. And in that moment, everything changed. The photograph. Nick's hands trembled as he held the worn photograph between his fingers, his grip tightening around the fragile paper as though it might disappear if he didn't hold on to it tightly enough. His heart pounded so violently in his chest that he thought the little girl sitting on his lap might hear it. The mall around him blurred. The twinkling Christmas lights overhead became hazy streaks, the jingle of holiday music melted into an indistinct hum, and the scent of peppermint and warm cinnamon from the food court faded into nothingness. Because in his hands was a face he never thought he would see again. A woman. Kira. Her smile was the same, soft and warm, the kind that could quiet his restless heart. Her dark curls framed her face, and her deep brown eyes held that same spark of mischief and kindness he had fallen in love with all those years ago. And in her arms. A baby. Nick swallowed hard, the edges of his vision blurring. His breath came in short, shallow gasps. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. Santa? Ava's small voice broke through his daze. Do you know my mommy? Nick blinked rapidly, his eyes shifting between the photo and the girl sitting before him. She was staring at him expectantly, her little hands gripping the edge of his sleeve. Her brown eyes, the same shade as Kira's, held something beyond childlike innocence. They were searching, waiting, hoping. Nick opened his mouth, but no words came out. His throat was dry, his tongue heavy. How? How was this possible? He had spent years looking for Kira. Decades. Endless nights spent wondering where she had gone, why she had left, why she had disappeared from his life without a trace. He had searched through old addresses, asked mutual friends, even followed cold trails that led to nothing. But he had never found her. And now, sitting in front of him, holding this piece of his past, was a little girl who had her eyes. Nick's hands trembled so violently that he nearly dropped the photograph. He clenched his jaw, trying to steady himself, trying to push back the overwhelming wave of emotions threatening to crash over him. Ava. His voice cracked as he forced the words out. Where did you get this? Ava tilted her head slightly, her small brows furrowing. It's my mommy, she said, as though that should explain everything. She gave it to me before she went to heaven. Nick froze. His entire body went cold. He stared at her, his mind reeling. Before she went to heaven. Before she went to... No. No, no, no. The words hit him like a punch to the gut, knocking the air from his lungs. Kira was gone. Dead? He barely noticed that the world around him was moving, kids laughing, parents talking, the click of cameras capturing other families' holiday memories. None of it felt real anymore. He forced himself to speak, his voice coming out hoarse. Your mommy's not here anymore. Ava shook her head. No. She got sick. A long time ago. Nick's chest constricted painfully. His fingers clenched around the edges of the photograph as if trying to hold on to something, anything, that would keep him from drowning in the sudden, suffocating grief that filled his lungs like ice water. Kira was gone. He would never find her. Never see her again. Never ask her why she left. Never tell her. Never tell her that he had never stopped loving her. Ava swung her legs slightly, watching him curiously. Grandma says you knew her. She said if I ever saw you, I should show you this picture. She said you'd understand. Understand? Nick didn't understand anything. He had spent his whole life carrying the weight of Kira's absence, cursing himself for losing her. And now, just like that, fate had thrown this little girl into his lap, a child with Kira's face, Kira's eyes, Kira's heart. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, staring at the picture, struggling to breathe. But then, a voice, stern and protective, cut through his haze. Ava, honey, what are you? Nick looked up, his eyes locking onto a woman standing a few feet away. She was older now, her dark hair streaked with gray, but he recognized her immediately. Margaret Carter. Kira's mother. And the moment she saw him, her expression shifted from surprise to something deeper. Something unreadable. She knew. She knew exactly who he was. Nick's heart pounded. He wanted to stand, but his legs felt like lead. Margaret's lips parted slightly, as though she wanted to say something, but then, just as quickly, she pressed them into a tight line. She grabbed Ava's hand gently but firmly. Come on, sweetie. It's time to go. Ava frowned. But Grandma. Now, Ava. Margaret's tone was soft, but there was no room for argument. Nick found his voice, though it was hoarse. Wait. Margaret stiffened. Ava looked between them, confused. Grandma, do you know Santa? Nick swallowed the lump in his throat. His fingers tightened around the photograph. Margaret hesitated for only a moment before answering, her voice quiet but firm. Yes, she said. Then, after a long pause, she added. Once, a long time ago. And with that, she turned, leading Ava away. Nick watched them go, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. He should have called after them. Should have demanded answers. Should have done something. But all he could do was sit there, the photograph burning in his hand, as the weight of his past came crashing down on him like an avalanche. Kira was gone. But her daughter, his daughter, was right there. And for the first time in decades, Nick realized that Christmas had given him something more than just another long, lonely December. It had given him a second chance. A chance to find the truth. A chance to know Ava. A chance to finally bring the past full circle. And he wasn't going to waste it. Not this time. A past unearthed. Nick sat frozen in his Santa chair long after Margaret and Ava had disappeared into the sea of holiday shoppers. The artificial snow continued to fall around him, catching in his thick white beard, but he didn't feel it. The weight of the past pressed against his chest like a heavy stone, suffocating him. Kira. Gone. The woman he had spent half his life searching for was never coming back. He clutched the photograph tightly, his fingers brushing against the edges as if the image might reveal something more, some hidden message, some unspoken truth. But it remained just a picture. A moment in time captured years ago. And then there was Ava. A little girl with Kira's face. Her eyes. Her warmth. His daughter? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. Could it be? Had Kira left because she had been pregnant? Had she been carrying his child all those years ago and never told him? Nick's stomach twisted. If that were true, if Ava was really his, then he had missed everything. Her first steps. Her first words. Her first Christmas. All of it. And not because he didn't want to be there. But because Kira had left. Or had she been taken away? His fingers tightened around the photograph, his breathing uneven. He had to know. Memories of another life. Nick's shift as Santa ended an hour later, though he barely remembered the remainder of the night. Kids had come and gone, voices blending together into an indistinguishable hum. When he finally stripped out of the red suit and stepped out into the crisp December air, the cold hit him like a slap to the face. It was late now. The streets outside the mall sparkled with festive lights, their warm glow casting long shadows on the pavement. Couples walked hand in hand, laughter drifting through the night, while families bundled up against the winter chill. Nick barely noticed any of it. Instead, he pulled out the photograph again, tracing his fingers over Kira's face. 24 years. That's how long it had been since she vanished. He had been a different man back then, reckless, lost, struggling to find his way. Kira had been his anchor, the one thing in his life that had felt real. They had dreamed of a future together. And then, one day, she was just gone. No goodbye. No explanation. Just silence. Nick had searched for her. At first, he thought she had simply needed space. Maybe she had gotten cold feet about their future together. But as the days turned into weeks, and then months, he realized something was terribly wrong. He had asked everyone, her friends, her family. But no one would tell him anything. Margaret had been especially cold. She's moved on, Nick. You need to do the same. He never believed that. Kira wouldn't have left him without a word. And now, 2 decades later, he had his answer. She hadn't abandoned him. She had been sick. She had died. And she had left behind a daughter. His daughter? Nick clenched his jaw, his breath curling in the cold night air. He had to find Margaret. She was the only one who could tell him the truth. The house on Mulberry Street. It took Nick almost an hour to track down Margaret's address. An old friend of his from the mall, Gary, still worked as security and knew just about everything that happened in town. After a little convincing, he handed over an address scribbled on a scrap of receipt paper. Be careful, Nick, Gary had warned. Margaret's not the same woman you remember. Nick barely heard him. He was already walking toward his car. The house on Mulberry Street was smaller than he remembered. A white picket fence lined the property, though the paint was chipped and peeling. A dim porch light flickered against the backdrop of Christmas decorations that seemed hastily placed, half-lit reindeer, a lopsided wreath, and a garland that sagged on one side. Nick took a deep breath and knocked. Silence. Then, the shuffle of feet behind the door. It creaked open, revealing Margaret Carter in a long, worn-out cardigan, her sharp eyes narrowing the moment she saw him. "Nick," she said, her voice unreadable. Nick swallowed hard. "Margaret." She studied him for a long moment before sighing. "I figured you'd come." "You knew?" His voice was hoarse. Margaret stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. The house smelled of cinnamon and something faintly medicinal. It was warm, cozy even, but there was a sadness in the air. Nick followed her into the living room, where a small Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated with handmade ornaments. A picture of Kira sat on the mantel. Next to it, a photo of Ava. Nick's chest tightened. "You knew I'd come," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret sat in an old armchair, folding her hands in her lap. "Of course I did," she said. "It was only a matter of time." Nick clenched his fists. "Why didn't you tell me?" Margaret sighed heavily, rubbing her temples. "Because Kira didn't want me to." Nick felt like he had been punched in the gut. "She didn't want me to know about Ava?" His voice cracked. Margaret hesitated, then shook her head. "No. She didn't want you to know about her illness. She thought it would be easier if you never found out." Nick stared at her. "Easier?" Margaret looked away. "She was young, Nick. Scared. She didn't want you to see her sick. She didn't want you to watch her die." Nick ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room. His heart ached with every word. "I could have helped. I would have helped." Margaret nodded. "I know. But she made me promise. She wanted you to have a life without that pain." Nick closed his eyes. "And Ava? Did she ever know about me?" Margaret hesitated. "Kira never told her much. She just said her father was a good man who loved her very much. But when she got older, when she started asking questions." Margaret looked up, her eyes filled with something Nick had never seen in them before. "Guilt. I wanted to tell her, Nick," she whispered. "I really did. But by then, I had convinced myself it was too late. That it would only hurt her." Nick exhaled sharply. "And now?" Margaret hesitated, then reached for a small, wrapped gift under the tree. She handed it to him. "Kira left this for you," she said. "She wrote your name on it before she passed." Nick's hands trembled as he took the box, his fingers brushing against the faded ribbon. It was small. Light. But somehow, it felt heavier than anything he had ever held. Margaret's voice was quiet. "She never stopped loving you, Nick." Nick's throat tightened as he stared at the gift in his hands. For 24 years, he had searched for answers. And now, on Christmas Eve, he was finally about to get them. But was he ready? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that this was just the beginning. The gift of lost time. Nick sat in the dimly lit living room of Margaret Carter's house, the weight of the small, wrapped gift pressing into his palms. The scent of cinnamon and pine filled the air, but it did nothing to ease the tightness in his chest. He stared down at the package, his name written in Kira's handwriting on the worn-out tag. It was delicate. Fragile. Much like the past he had spent years chasing. Margaret sat across from him, her fingers clasped in her lap, her gaze heavy but unreadable. "She left that for you before she passed," Margaret murmured. "I wasn't sure if I should give it to you. But now, I think it's time." Nick swallowed hard. He wasn't sure if he was ready to open it. 24 years. That's how long he had searched for answers, for any piece of Kira that remained in this world. And now, here it was, wrapped in faded red paper and a frayed ribbon. His hands trembled as he carefully pulled the ribbon loose and peeled back the wrapping. Inside was a small, leather-bound journal. Nick exhaled shakily, his fingers running over the cover. It was old, the edges slightly worn, as if it had been held many times. He slowly flipped it open, his breath catching as he saw the first page. To Nick, the love of my life. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. But it also means you found your way back to me. And for that, I am grateful. His throat tightened. His vision blurred. The handwriting was undeniably Kira's, elegant, flowing, familiar. He could almost hear her voice in his head, reading each word aloud. He turned the page. I never wanted to leave you, Nick. But I had to. I had no choice. Nick's hands clenched around the book. His pulse pounded in his ears. What did she mean? He read on. The truth that was stolen. I was pregnant, Nick. And I was scared. I was young, and I didn't know what to do. But I knew one thing, I wanted to keep our baby. I wanted her to have a good life, a stable life. Nick's breath hitched. Ava. She was his. His daughter. He let out a shaky exhale, his heart hammering against his ribs. He turned the page with trembling fingers. But then, things got complicated. My mother found out. She was furious. She didn't want me raising a child with a man she thought was too lost, too unstable. She said you weren't ready. She convinced me you would only bring pain into our daughter's life. Nick's jaw clenched. Margaret. She had taken Kira from him. She had stolen not just Kira's love, but the life they could have had together. His grip on the journal tightened, anger boiling beneath the surface. But he kept reading. I fought her, Nick. I swear I did. But then I got sick. Nick's breath caught. It started small, just feeling tired all the time, dizzy spells, weakness. But then the doctors said the words I never wanted to hear. Leukemia. Aggressive. They said I had a chance if I started treatment immediately. But that meant I wouldn't be able to take care of our baby. And my mother, she saw it as an opportunity. Nick felt a lump rise in his throat. She told me she would take care of Ava. That she would give her everything I couldn't. And she made me promise, Nick. She made me promise not to tell you. She said you were already too broken, that it would destroy you. And I believed her. His hands were shaking now. She had been sick. She had been dying. And instead of reaching out to him, she had been convinced that he wasn't strong enough to handle it. Nick squeezed his eyes shut. Had he been that lost back then? Had he been so consumed by his own demons that Margaret had been right to keep Kira and Ava away from him? Or had he changed too late? He turned the page again, his breath uneven. I regret it every single day, Nick. I should have told you. I should have let you be part of her life. But by the time I realized it, I was already too weak to fight anymore. Nick swallowed hard. I'm so sorry, my love. If there's one thing I want you to know, it's this, you were never the mistake. Loving you was never the mistake. The only mistake was letting you go. A tear slipped down Nick's cheek. He turned to the final page. Ava is yours, Nick. She is the best of both of us. Please, if you ever find her, love her. Be there for her in the way I couldn't be. Be the father she never got to know. Nick closed the book, his hands shaking. Kira had never stopped loving him. She had wanted him to know the truth. But she had been robbed of the chance. And now, Ava had grown up without a father because of it. Nick lifted his gaze, his eyes burning with unshed tears. Margaret was watching him, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair, her lips pressed into a tight line. Why? Nick's voice was hoarse, filled with years of sorrow and anger. Why did you do it? Margaret looked away. I thought I was protecting them. Protecting her. From me? His voice cracked. Margaret exhaled heavily. You were falling apart, Nick. You drank. You gambled. You were lost. I didn't think you were fit to be a father. Nick clenched his fists. I got better, Margaret. I turned my life around. But I never got the chance to prove that to Kira because you took that chance away. Margaret looked down, her face shadowed with guilt. I know, she whispered. And I will regret it for the rest of my life. Nick let out a shaky breath. Anger still burned inside him, but there was no point in shouting. It wouldn't change the past. It wouldn't bring Kira back. But it could change the future. Nick stood, gripping the journal tightly. Where is Ava? Margaret looked up, her eyes searching his. She's at home, she said softly. She doesn't know who you are, Nick. Not really. Then it's time she did, he said firmly. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. You have every right to know her, she admitted. But please, Nick, don't just tell her. Show her. Be the man she deserves. Nick's throat tightened. He had spent his life running from the past. But now, finally, he had the chance to build a future. And he wasn't going to waste it. Not this time. Not ever again. A Christmas redemption. The drive to Ava's home was a blur. Nick barely felt the cold steering wheel beneath his fingers, barely noticed the Christmas lights flashing past as he navigated through the quiet, snow-covered streets. His mind was trapped somewhere between the past and the present, caught in a tangled web of emotions that had been buried for decades. Kira's journal sat on the passenger seat beside him, its presence both comforting and crushing. For years, he had blamed himself for losing her. For years, he had believed she had walked away from their love. And now, after all this time, he finally knew the truth. She hadn't left him. She had been taken from him, by illness, by fear, by a mother who thought she was doing the right thing. And Ava. Ava had grown up never knowing her father, believing a lie of omission. Nick tightened his grip on the wheel. That ended tonight. A house filled with memories. Ava's house was small but warm, glowing with the golden light of Christmas decorations. A modest tree stood in the window, its colorful lights twinkling against the frost-kissed glass. The sight made something inside Nick's chest tighten. He parked on the curb, exhaling a long breath before stepping out. The cold air hit him instantly, but he barely felt it. This was it. A second chance. A chance he never thought he'd get. His feet felt heavy as he walked up the short path to the front door. Each step carried the weight of 24 years of regret, of missed birthdays, of Christmases spent alone. Finally, he raised his fist and knocked. The sound echoed through the quiet street. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, footsteps. The door creaked open. And there she was. Ava. She looked up at him, her brown eyes filled with the same quiet curiosity as before. She was still in her pink pajamas, a reindeer design printed across the front. Her curly hair was pulled back into two small puffs, and she clutched a half-eaten candy cane in her hand. Santa? She asked, tilting her head. Nick let out a soft, shaky laugh. Not exactly, he admitted. Just Nick. Ava squinted at him, as if trying to figure something out. What are you doing here? Nick hesitated, his heart pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. How do you tell a child that you are the father she never knew? That you missed everything not by choice, but by fate? That you would give anything, everything, to turn back time? Before he could find the right words, another voice interrupted. Ava, who's at the door? Margaret appeared, her face weary, her expression guarded. But when her eyes met Nick's, something softened in them. Nick swallowed. Can we talk? Margaret glanced down at Ava, then back at him. A long silence passed between them before she nodded. Ava, honey, go upstairs for a bit, okay? Ava frowned but obeyed, casting one last curious glance at Nick before disappearing down the hallway. Margaret stepped aside, letting Nick in. A father's first steps. The house was filled with traces of Kira. Photos lined the walls, some of Ava, some of Kira and Margaret together. But none of Nick. He swallowed the bitter taste in his throat as he turned to Margaret. I want to know her, he said, his voice rough. I need to know her. Margaret sighed, rubbing her hands together as if trying to warm them. Nick, it's not that simple. Nick clenched his fists. It is to me. She doesn't know you. I should have been here, he snapped, anger flashing in his voice. I should have known she existed. But you, he exhaled sharply, forcing himself to calm down. You took that away from me. Margaret's expression faltered. I know. The admission caught him off guard. I know, Nick, she repeated, her voice thick with regret. And I will never forgive myself for keeping you away from her. But I can't change the past. All I can do is try to make it right now. Nick nodded, running a hand down his face. Then let me see her. Let me tell her who I am. Margaret hesitated. You can't just drop this on her. She's a little girl, Nick. This isn't a fairy tale where everything just magically fixes itself overnight. Nick let out a slow breath. Then help me. Please. Margaret studied him for a long moment, then finally gave a small nod. The first Christmas together. It was late. Snow had started falling again outside, the world beyond the window blanketed in white. Ava sat cross-legged on the floor, her tiny hands carefully placing ornaments on a small wooden tree. Nick watched her, his heart aching with every second that passed. This was his daughter. And she had no idea. He cleared his throat. Ava? She looked up at him. Nick hesitated, then slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph, the same one she had shown him at the mall. Ava's eyes widened. That's my mommy. Nick smiled, his throat tightening. I know. She was very special to me. Ava tilted her head. Did you know her? Nick exhaled. Yeah, sweetheart. I knew her better than anyone. Ava's small fingers traced the edges of the photo. She used to tell me stories about a man she loved a long time ago. She said he was kind, but sad. And that he had a good heart, even when he didn't believe it. Nick's chest ached. She told you that? Ava nodded. She said she wished he could have met me. Nick's hands shook. He looked at Margaret, who gave him a small nod. He turned back to Ava. I think she was talking about me, he said softly. Ava blinked. You? Nick nodded. I was that man, Ava. He swallowed. I was your mommy's love. And his voice cracked. I'm your daddy. Silence filled the room. Ava's little brows furrowed as she looked at the photograph again. Then back at him. Something flickered in her expression, realization, understanding, disbelief. You're my daddy, she whispered. Nick nodded, his eyes burning. Ava didn't move at first. Then, after what felt like forever, she reached out, her tiny fingers brushing against his hand. Did you love my mommy? She asked softly. Nick's throat tightened. With all my heart, he whispered. I never stopped. Ava studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide if she believed him. Then, slowly, she crawled into his lap, wrapping her small arms around him. Nick sucked in a sharp breath, his body going rigid for a moment. Then he melted. He closed his eyes, his arms tightening around her, and for the first time in over 2 decades, the weight of the past finally began to lift. He had missed so much. But he had been given a second chance. And he wasn't going to waste it. Not now. Not ever again. The future of Christmas. Nick held Ava in his arms for what felt like forever, his heart pounding as he finally let himself believe, really believe, that he was holding his daughter. His little girl. Ava. The name felt sacred now, a missing piece of himself that had finally been returned. Her tiny arms clung to him tightly, and he could feel her small, warm breaths against his chest. The scent of peppermint from her candy cane still lingered in her hair, mixed with something softer, something that reminded him of Kira. Nick had spent his entire life searching for something to fill the hole Kira had left. And now, here she was. His second chance. His daughter. And she had chosen to embrace him. A home reclaimed. Margaret watched the two of them in silence, standing by the small Christmas tree in the corner of the living room. There was a deep sadness in her eyes, but also something else. Something softer. She had spent decades believing she was doing the right thing by keeping Nick away. But now, seeing them together, she knew she had made a mistake. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "Ava, honey," she said gently, "it's getting late. You should get ready for bed." Ava hesitated, tightening her grip around Nick's neck. "But Grandma." Margaret gave her a small smile. "Santa will be here soon, remember?" Ava pulled back slightly, looking up at Nick. Her deep brown eyes searched his, hesitant but hopeful. "Are you staying?" Nick's throat tightened. Before he could answer, Margaret spoke. "Yes, sweetheart," she said softly. "He's staying." Nick glanced at her in surprise, but she just gave him a small nod. A silent acknowledgement. A silent apology. Ava smiled, then hopped off his lap and ran toward the hallway. "I'm gonna put out cookies for Santa," she called, disappearing around the corner. Nick let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The silence between him and Margaret stretched for a moment. Finally, she spoke. "She loves Christmas," she murmured. Nick swallowed, nodding. "I can tell." Margaret hesitated, then sighed, running a hand down her face. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Nick. I don't deserve it. But I meant what I said earlier." Nick turned to her, his hands clenched at his sides. "I want you in her life," Margaret said. "And if Kira were here, I know she'd want that too." Nick let out a shaky breath. It wasn't a full apology. It wasn't enough to erase what had been lost. But it was something. It was the beginning of something new. And right now, that was all that mattered. Christmas morning. Nick barely slept that night. He lay awake on the small pull-out couch in the living room, listening to the sound of the winter wind outside, his mind racing with the events of the last 24 hours. Ava was his. His little girl. And now, after all these years, he finally had the chance to be her father. When morning came, it was the sound of Ava's excited giggles that pulled him from his thoughts. Santa came, she squealed, running into the living room. He ate the cookies. Nick sat up with a groggy smile, rubbing his eyes. Did he now? Ava nodded furiously, her curls bouncing. And he left so many presents. She ran over to the tree, her little hands reaching for the brightly wrapped packages. Margaret appeared in the doorway, a warm but tired smile on her face. Nick hesitated for a moment before standing. He walked over to the tree and knelt beside Ava, watching as she carefully inspected each gift, her face filled with wonder. Then, without thinking, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, wrapped package. A gift he had bought on a whim earlier that week. A gift he had never expected to give. He handed it to her. Ava looked up at him, her eyes wide. For me? Nick nodded. Yeah, sweetheart. From me to you. Ava's tiny hands peeled away the wrapping paper, revealing a delicate silver locket. She gasped, opening it carefully. Inside was a picture. A picture of Kira. And a picture of Nick. Together. Before everything fell apart. Ava traced her little fingers over the image, then looked up at him. Is this, you and Mommy? She asked softly. Nick swallowed hard, nodding. Yeah. It is. Ava's lips curled into a small smile. She closed the locket and clutched it tightly to her chest. I love it, she whispered. Nick felt a lump in his throat, but he forced himself to smile. I'm glad. Ava suddenly lunged forward, wrapping her arms around his neck. Best Christmas ever, she whispered. Nick let out a shaky breath, holding her close. Yeah, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Best Christmas ever. The gift of second chances. As the morning unfolded, laughter filled the house. For the first time in over 2 decades, Nick felt something he hadn't felt in years. Belonging. Love. Family. And as he sat there, watching Ava unwrap her gifts, watching the joy light up her face, he knew one thing for certain. Christmas wasn't about the presents. It wasn't about the decorations or the lights or the traditions. It was about the people we hold close. The people we fight for. The people we find our way back to. And as Ava climbed into his lap, still clutching her new locket, Nick knew that this moment, this family, this love, was the greatest gift he had ever received. And he would never let it go again. Not now. Not ever. Because some gifts, some second chances, only come once in a lifetime. And this time, he wasn't going to waste it.